Good morning and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I am Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds. And this morning we're going to talk about nitrogen. So last week we talked about phosphorus and potassium and some of the things that we can do, or maybe areas or fields that we can maybe tweak or cut back to save a little bit given the high input costs that we're dealing with this year. And nitrogen is no exception, obviously. It's also went over double in price this fall, and we're not sure when that's going to come back down. So it's good to look at some of these things and remind ourselves why we do what we're doing and where in ways where we can cut back or maybe pay attention so that we're making the best use of our nitrogen fertilizers. So I want to start off with a Purdue University study, my alma mater. They did a study here in the last several years looking back over 70 years of corn hybrids and how they utilize nitrogen. And the one thing that they found, which we've talked about before, is that we've seen over a 90% gain in 70 short years. We've seen a 90% gain in yield and a 73% gain in nitrogen utilization. So what does that mean? So if you want to think about it this way, we're putting on around 180 to 200 pounds of nitrogen on our corn and getting roughly 90% more yield than we would have 70 years ago. So obviously nitrogen rates have changed some, but in the last 30 years or so, they've kind of remained stagnant, but yields continue to increase. So really the hybrids that we're dealing with nowadays, the hybrids that we're selecting on a daily basis to try and make sure we get the best hybrids for our customers, are better utilizing that nitrogen more efficiently, especially in drought years like this year. So keep that in mind as we go through this, how our modern hybrids are utilizing nitrogen better, which gives us an opportunity on the management side to tweak our practices to make sure we're making the best use of it too. So what's the first question that we should be asking this fall? Well, we always go through these, but the first thing I would say is, what are your soil temps and soil types? And then let's look at the extended forecast. So obviously we're sitting here, I know if you look at the state of Iowa, it's kind of split right now. The north part of it and the northern part of Latham country is under the 50-degree mark in terms of a 4-inch soil temperature, which is where we want to see it. But we also want to make sure that it stays there. So if you're seeing an extended forecast that looks really good and in the 60s and 70s, that's not conducive to putting on something like anhydrous or any nitrogen fertilizer and making sure that it stays in the soil in the form that we want until next spring when the plants can utilize it. Obviously we get the best uptake when we're applying it when the plants need it. So when we're applying it in the fall, we got to do every precaution to make sure that it stays in that form. So look ahead at those soil temps, make sure that you're really watching that 4-inch soil temperature to make sure that I would really prefer to see 45 degrees or less and it's still declining, but obviously you have to get those operations done before it freezes, so that's a consideration too. On the soil type side of things, I just want to point out, especially, many people may be asking, well, we're in a drought situation, we just recently got some rain here in Iowa, but in many cases we're still pretty dry, the soil moisture and the subsoil moisture. How does that impact our choices on nitrogen and what could happen to the nitrogen when we put it out there? Well, in most cases, in most of our territory, we do have pretty heavy soil types, nice prairie parent materials and soil, so a lot of those held moisture better than we think. And when you put a product out like anhydrous ammonia, it's going to grab any moisture that's there, and there's likely enough there that will change forms and continue the nitrogen cycle. And we'll talk about that here in a second, but just keep that in mind. The other thing that I keep thinking about is that we're in a drought situation and it's kind of going on 2 years, and it seems like to me there's going to be a course correction at some point. Likely could mean more moisture, whether it's this fall yet still or maybe even in the spring. So those things kind of come into play. If you're putting nitrogen on a sandy soil situation, you can think about that CEC factor. It's not necessarily it's a guideline, I'd say, but not necessarily something you'd want to hold as a fact. The 10 times your CEC, it can hold that much in terms of ammonium form of nitrogen out there. It's a good guideline because it gives you an understanding of, okay, if sandy soil is going to have a much lower ability to hold on to those ammonium forms of a cation. So just keep that in mind. If you're in a really heavy soil situation like a silty clay or silty clay loam or something like that, that could potentially back up with water and have the opposite effect, and we could be denitrifying that and losing it in a couple different ways. You got to think about those things too. So obviously sandy soil situations are not really a great idea to be putting that on in the fall. If you can wait till spring on the soils that are heavier and can hold on to those forms of nitrogen, are a much better option for applying in the fall. So I want to go through I've got a couple field signs here. We're just going to go through a little bit of a run through, a simplified run through, I'll say that, of the nitrogen cycle. So I want to talk through a couple forms of nitrogen that's typically applied all throughout Latham country. And number one is going to be anhydrous, and then number two is manure. And there's a lot of manure that goes on depending where you're at. Could be various forms. It could be swine, liquid hog manure. It could be cattle manure. It could be poultry manure, or whatever the case. And they all have their benefits. They all provide a myriad of different nutrients that our crops desperately need, and typically provide better sources, organic sources that break down slower over time. So I don't discourage anybody from using manures, but we got to think about it in terms of nitrogen when we're applying it in the fall and what can be lost. So I just want to walk through a couple of these. And let's start with anhydrous. So hopefully you can get a good idea of what's going on here. This is a very simplified version of the nitrogen cycle. Obviously it would take too long to go through this all, but I just want to talk about the steps and the process, what happens when you put it in the soil. So we've probably all either seen anhydrous go on or applied it ourselves. It's kind of a scary thing to deal with, but as long as you respect it, it's all right. But it is a very good form of nitrogen, and a very concentrated form as well. But when you put that anhydrous ammonia in the soil, anhydrous ammonia is NH3. So when it goes into the soil, the first thing it's going to do, obviously it doesn't have any water with it. It's a gas. It's a water loving. So it's going to grab water as soon as it can, and then it's going to quickly form ammonium, which adds another hydrogen to that to make NH4. Now NH4 is a great form of nitrogen. That's what we want to see. That's a form that plants can take up. So having some ammonium, and then later on down the road here, nitrate, both those forms are forms that a plant can take up. But in the fall, this is where we want to keep it. So these things here, once it's in an ammonium form, there's bacteria in the soil that are going to work as it's over 50 degrees in the soil. They're going to work to break it down, and what they're going to break it down into is forms that we don't necessarily want to see, especially in the fall, and that's nitrite and nitrate. So these two, nitrate especially, is the one we always talk about, leaching down into groundwater. So this is what we don't want to see when we get lots of rain, or maybe you're putting it on in that heavy soil type that floods and stays in an anaerobic state, and that's what happens. Then it can go up and into the air. Those oxygens will be stripped off, and it'll be either an N2 gas or a nitrogen gas or a nitrous oxide gas, so it's going to be lost to the atmosphere. So preferably, if we can keep it back here in this form, whether it's anhydrous or manure, that's going to be favorable to us going into next spring. So that's what we want to do. A lot of times when we put manure down, so if we're talking about something like a liquid hog manure, you can see up to 90% or better utilization of that nitrogen in the year that it's applied, which is great. It's an outstanding source of nitrogen. But when you apply it, it's typically, most of it's going to be in ammonium form or ammonium and ammonia, which can easily be lost as it's applied and put on the ground. It's going to be lost almost instantly, depending what percentage of it is in which form. So if it's not incorporated, and there's obviously going to be some in an ammonia form, it's going to be lost immediately. So incorporation is a good thing with manures, liquid manures especially. Things like poultry manure still have the ammonia form in them, but not quite as concentrated. So you don't have quite as much risk, but any of them it's better to incorporate if you can. Obviously a rain can do a similar thing, but you have to rely on a rain, which depending where you're at, some of us have struggled to get rain. So the other good thing about this, if we look at this equation, is we can put a nitrification inhibitor in here. And that nitrification inhibitor does essentially the same thing is what anhydrous would do is when you put it on. Anhydrous, when it goes into the soil, is essentially going to kill everything, microbes around it, when it goes into that soil. Nitrification inhibitor can go into either one and can protect it in that form for several week period. So if you're putting it on in the fall, it's going to help you in the fall and not likely help you much in the spring, obviously. So you're still at a risk in the early spring when things warm up and we don't have a plant growing. But it keeps more of it in this form until we get to spring. So really that's what we want to do. We don't want to see it slide into this form as much as possible. Obviously some of that will happen, but the more we can keep it in this form, whether we're putting on anhydrous or a manure source of nitrogen, we want to see that happen. So when it comes to manures, like I mentioned before, all those sources are great sources. Each one has a different elements to one thing or another. Way they may be better at one thing than another source of manure, but liquid swine manure is a very good source of nitrogen. Obviously phosphorus as well. Poultry manure, typically you'll see at least 50% available in the first year, and dairy and beef are somewhere around that 50%, less or more, just depends. Obviously we've mentioned it before, but getting a test is probably the most important thing that you can do so that you know what's being put on your field and you know what nutrients you can account for. And then we need to protect it, whether that's incorporating it in the ground, using a nitrification inhibitor if it's over 50 degrees of soil temperature. If we use that as essentially an insurance to keep it in that form longer, it's a cheap insurance to keep that there so that we have it for next spring. So just to wrap things up, I just want to mention a couple things real quick. And the one is I'm actually standing in the middle of our Latham Premier Agronomy Center plots, and particularly this one's not growing yet, but it is our cover crop plot. Just planted it here last week after harvest. So if you have cover crops growing out there and you're pulling on anhydrous or you're putting on manure in the middle of a cover crop, that's great. That's one benefit that's really going to help you, because what that cover crop's going to do is anything that gets into this form, the nitrate form, it's going to grab because those roots are growing. So it's going to pull it back up and keep it at the surface and not let it keep leaching down, because the further that leaches down, the less likely your corn next season is able to get a hold of it, especially if you have tile. So a cover crop would be a great option as well. It would also help you. Any of these things that you can do, that a nitrification inhibitor, cover crop, all those things combined is going to help you keep that nitrogen there in a form that's usable next season for next year's corn crop. The other thing is, as a Latham product team, we obviously strive to know our products extremely well, and this is something that we've, over many years of looking at products, continue to get better at and can give advice for those that are looking for more advice on which hybrids maybe prefer late season or mid-season nitrogen or early season, things like that. Every hybrid responds a little bit different to nitrogen, and that's something that we pride ourselves in knowing and understanding, continue to learn more as we provide more great hybrids to our customers. So just think about all these things as you're applying nitrogen this fall or having nitrogen applied. You want to make the best utilization of it you possibly can and keep it there for next season. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, give us a call, or reach out to us on any of our social media platforms. We look forward to hearing from you and look forward to talking to you next time.